This week I'm sharing 4 meals that we had for dinner, utilizing some of the things coming out of the garden right now. The first up is this sesame salmon bowl. It's inspired by a rice bowl that I loved getting when we lived in Sydney. And you'll see that I have these 2 little pickling cucumbers that I also threw into my bowl. I haven't gotten a large enough flush to do an actual batch of pickles yet, but this is another way that I use up some of the garden produce when it's just trickling in at the beginning, is I'll use things like pickling cucumbers just as a slicing cucumber. The original bowl that I used to get also had shredded beets in it, which I do love. I just don't have any in my garden this summer. I might grow some in my fall garden with this specifically in mind. This is something that we have once a week or every other week. The dressing is toasted sesame oil, rice vinegar, brown sugar, and sesame seeds. So in the bowl, I just lit up the rice, kale, the sliced cucumber, shredded carrot, if you had the beets. I also like to add some kind of onion, so I'm using some leftover thinly sliced red onion that we had from another meal. I'll use scallions or green onions if we have them. I have some steamed edamame. And then we had it this night with a roasted steelhead. We also like it with regular, like Atlantic salmon, or I love this with roasted tofu as well. And then the last step is that you have to put a good handful of crispy onions or fried shallots on top. The next recipe is a classic standby with a slight new twist. It's a squash blossom quesadilla. I'm starting off by getting some black beans going in my Instant Pot. I pretty much only cook dried beans, and only this way just because it's so fast. While the beans were cooking, I went out and I harvested my one white scallop squash that I have so far, and a bunch of squash blossoms. I had never had a squash blossom quesadilla prior to this. It wasn't something that was really even on my radar, but my brother-in-law is from Mexico and asked what I was planning on doing with all my squash blossoms, because I have a ton on my plants this year. And I said nothing. And he had asked if he could have some, because there is this kind of classic preparation where you kind of fry them up, sometimes with veggies like I'm doing here, and put them into a quesadilla. The beans are done at this point, and I'm adding a bunch of my homemade garlic scape salt that I made earlier in the season. And then I'm adding in the squash blossoms. I removed the stamen, and for most of them I also removed the kind of base of the flower, which is what I had read to do in one recipe. But after having had these, I think next time you can see that one or two of them still have that base of the flower bud in it. And I did read in another recipe to leave it on there. I would leave it on there in the future, because I think the petal only just wilted away to almost nothing, even though I waited until the last minute to toss them into the veggies. They're just so fragile. The few that we left the base of the flower bud on had a really beautiful vegetal taste, and they also held up much better. The next recipe is a fennel crab spaghetti. This is originally a Jamie Oliver recipe. I've been making it for years and years, and it's the primary reason why I wanted to try to grow fennel this year. This fennel is a little woodier than a bulb that you would get at the grocery store. I do think mine is not loving how hot it is here. In the future, I'm going to try to do a midsummer planting for a fall harvest and hopefully get better bulbs. We'll see. The recipe also calls to use fresh cherry tomatoes, and instead I'm going to opt to finally use up some of the cherry tomatoes that I have left over from last garden season. I had a really prolific cherry tomato year, and I just rinsed them off and threw them in Ziploc bags, and ended up with maybe 5 or 6 of these Ziploc bags full of cherry tomatoes. So you add the crab at the last minute, warm it through, and then toss the pasta in. Then you serve it up with the kind of picked off pieces of prawns on top. I always like to add a ton. I think honestly I would probably like eat all of this off the top and then add more. And we also had some Parmesan on it, which we don't normally do, but it was really delicious. The next recipe is one that I think we're always looking for as gardeners, and that's a way to use up zucchini. We love to have a Friday night pizza night in our house, and this is one that you can make just in the oven. It's a pan pizza style, and I'll link the dough recipe I use down below. And then I'm using my tromboncino squash because I grow that in lieu of a regular green zucchini. The tromboncino does tend to have these larger seed sections in the bottom because it can grow to be kind of gourd-like, but I just scraped those out and still grate it up, and it's great. I cook this in a cast iron skillet, which the pan pizza dough recipe does call for, and I find that it gives a really beautiful crisp crust and it doesn't sog out on the bottom like it sometimes would if I cook it in a metal baking tray. The recipe calls to squeeze out the liquid with your hands, but I also love Smitten Kitchen's zucchini fritter recipe, and that calls to squeeze it out in a dish towel or a cheesecloth. And I don't know why I didn't do that here. This is not very effective. I would recommend not following the recipe in this instance and using some kind of towel to drain out the liquid. And you bake that in a very hot oven, as hot as your oven can go and as hot as whatever pan you're using will allow. I know some stoneware can only go to like 450, so I would just double check whatever you're using. And then you bake it for 20-25 minutes, depending on how dark you want it to be. I ended up turning my heat up a little bit because I love when the top of the cheese and the breadcrumbs get really crispy. And I remember the first time I made this recipe, I thought, there's no way it could be that good. It's essentially 5 ingredients. And every time it blows my mind at just how delicious it is. I hope that helps you with some inspiration as the garden season is picking up and you might have an abundance of produce sitting on your kitchen counter. Thanks for watching.